Welcome to another episode of The Vital Point, everyone. Today's episode is special. Beautiful conversation with Buddhist meditation teacher Scott Tusa. The conversation, I just got finished with it, definitely had a particular flavor of sort of a Buddhist framework. You know, we talked about a lot of Buddhist concepts and Buddhist ideas and use some different vocabulary. And so, if you follow that and it feels in alignment to you, wonderful. I think the beautiful thing for me about Buddhism is that you don't have to identify as a Buddhist to get the benefit. I've always considered Buddhism as like a system and different processes that can be followed for a particular outcome, in particular those outcomes of becoming more compassionate, becoming more patient, seeing the world in a more grounded, more loving way, and a slew of other things. But for me, those systems are completely sectarian. You know, they integrate with any religious or spiritual beliefs that you have or don't have, you know, even if you don't consider that you have any of those. But considering the framework from which we're coming from in this conversation, I just wanted to give you a couple of definitions so that you don't feel lost as you're listening to this amazing conversation. So some of the things that we talked about, or some of the terms that you might hear, and I made some notes as we were talking. So first of all, there's a term that Scott uses of dukkha. Dukkha is suffering, and the inherent sort of suffering that the Buddha talked about, within the Buddhist context of that suffering is a part of life, and that pain can be separated from suffering, but that these sufferings are a part of life, no matter how rosy we want to view things. You know, we get old, we die, we get sick, we lose things that we care about. And there's an inherent suffering to that. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way that things are. So that's dukkha. We also talk a lot about bodhicitta and a bodhisattva. And bodhicitta is the considering and treating everyone with unconditional love and loving kindness and compassion. In the Tibetan Buddhist context, the way that this is expressed is that you're treating everyone with the same love that you would treat your mother. And sometimes in a modern context, that can be a little strange because we don't all have wonderful relationships with our mothers. But treating everyone with this unconditional love. And a bodhisattva is somebody that practices, somebody that has completely integrated and embodied bodhicitta, as we get into. We also talk a lot about emptiness, the idea of emptiness, which is really talking about non-dualistic perspective that things don't have a independent existence to themselves. Everything is relative and interdependent upon everything else. We also he mentions pujas at one point. Those are like a religious celebration. And then we talk about Mahayana and Vajrayana quite a bit. And you might notice that those have the same commonality of yanas. Yana is vehicle or path. So those are two different sort of paths of Buddhism. Mahayana being the greater vehicle, Vajrayana being the diamond vehicle. Those are the direct translations, but the Mahayana being the giving up the idea of achieving enlightenment just for yourself, instead thinking about helping all sentient beings to Buddhahood, and you do that by developing bodhicitta. And then Vajrayana being the tantric teachings, the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism, primarily the teachings of transmutation, of alchemy, of transmuting and really cutting through the deception in which we usually see the world through. And last but not least, we talked a little bit about shamatha and vipassana or vishpashyana, which is meditation. So shamatha is calm abiding, is mindfulness practice, and vipassana is insight meditation. So these are two different aspects of meditation practice. So those are a few of the different terms that we used, and skip a couple of minutes ahead to the beginning of the conversation. But otherwise, I hope that you find this little appendix helpful so that you don't get lost in the vocabulary that we're using. And I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I had making it. When it comes to self-development, no matter the method you use, the vital point is to practice. If you're ready to transform your life and claim the potential inside of you, then you're in the right place. Welcome to The Vital Point. I'm your host, Jonathan Schechter. I'm a psychedelic integration and transformation coach, breathwork facilitator, and an enthusiast of personal growth. You have the capacity to evolve and bring your intentions and dreams into the world, and there's never been more access to so many incredible modalities that can help you on your journey. This podcast will help you learn simple methods you can use to transform your life and share the stories of practitioners who are doing the work so that you feel inspired to go and practice, because that's the vital point. My guest today on the show is Scott Tusa. We're welcoming him back to the podcast. He's a Buddhist meditation teacher and practitioner who spent the last 23 years exploring how to embody and live meaningfully through the Buddhist path. At age 16, his mother's death sparked a deep longing for healing and spiritual wisdom that eventually led him to Tibetan Buddhism. He spent his early 20s seeking out and learning from a variety of Tibetan Buddhist masters and was ordained by His Holiness the Dalai Lama as a Buddhist monk at age 28. Scott spent the next 9 years as a monk, deepening his understanding of the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings, engaging in solitary meditation retreats, and continuing his studies with teachers in India, Nepal, and the United States, including his main teachers, Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Tsoknyi Rinpoche. Since 2008, he's been teaching Buddhist meditation in groups and in one-on-one settings in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and online, bringing Buddhist wisdom to modern meditators, helping them develop more confidence, inner wisdom, and joy in their practice. And it is my pleasure to welcome Scott back to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's great to be back. I think it's been like almost exactly a year, right?
Yeah, something like that. So it's been really great to like reconnect with some of the earlier guests on the podcast. You know, feels like a good growth.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last time we were talking from the jungles of Colombia.
We were, yeah. And I remember being very nervous if the internet was going to hold up for that conversation. And I think it barely did, because we were just, I was in the middle of nowhere, and a friend on his property put up a satellite internet. That was the only way I could do it.
Nice. It was meant to be. So yeah, before we hit record, we were talking a little bit about, you know, the kind of concept that sometimes I think we have in terms of idealizing a monastic life, or this idea that maybe the problems that we're encountering, or the solutions that we feel like we need, can be found elsewhere, you know, can be found by going into retreat or becoming a monk. I've had conversations like that with my partner, you know, at one point, this was when I first started studying Buddhism, 20 years ago. And I got really, really into it. Like I was like, this is the answer. This is everything I've been looking for. And after I, discovered and started practicing Tibetan Buddhism, uh, doing a 3-year retreat seemed like the thing to do, like the answer to all
Yeah.
my problems. And I I've at least hit pause on that aspiration for many years. It led me to Tibet and back to the United States, and I'm fortunate now to be, being more involved in teaching Dharma and practicing Dharma in my own way. But I don't really have that aspiration anymore.
Mm.
But my partner, being the supportive person that she is, has said, well, don't you want to do that? And there's been times where she's like, I think everything would be so much simpler and better if we just both went into 3-year retreat. Like we wouldn't have to
Yeah.
worry about this and that and the other thing. And I'm like, I don't think it's that simple. I'm not sure if you're really thinking this through. So I know that you are uniquely qualified to really talk about this topic based on your experience. And I think it's a good place to jump in.
Sure. Um, yeah, I think it's one of these. It's one of these gray areas where yes, like in order to deepen in something as vast and profound as any of the Buddhisms still existent in the world. You and I have more of a connection to Tibetan Buddhism and those lineages. Um, in order to deepen in them, we need to spend time, and I think I don't even think that's necessarily a spiritual perspective. I think that's just sort of like a human habitual,
Yeah.
reality of anything. Like if we want to, anyone who's quote unquote gifted or genius at what they do, pretty much 100% of those people, maybe with like a very few who were just born very unique with a talent, but pretty much 100% of those individuals spent hours and hours and hours and hours at their sport or craft or instrument or job, work or whatever. And so there's just this kind of undeniable reality, I think, of like the time we need to put into it. But then I think there's this gray area or question of, well, what does that time have to look like, right? And that's often, with mentees and students I'm working with, that's often the question, because most people I encounter, they don't have the same situation as I did, where I was able to become a monk at 28. I mean, even before that, I was able to go into some retreat and practice quite a bit in my 20s because it's just what I was interested in. Among other things, I was a recording engineer and producing rock bands in the Bay Area, so I was also interested in that and being a musician. But yeah, and then at 28, I was able to become a monk. I was able to spend probably a total of 3 or 4 years in retreat. I haven't really added it up. It's probably like 4 to 6 months each year in retreat over 9 years. Someone better at math than me could probably add that up. And so I was able to kind of like follow that dream, so to speak, that you're speaking to, that you were having your that conversation with your partner about. And was it beneficial? Yes. Could I say, like, could I sit here and say I'd be in the same relationship as I am to my Dharma practice if I didn't go through that? No, I mean, of course not. Our life is cumulative, right?
Right.
For anything we do. But I also sit as a householder with a young daughter now and a partner, and in this kind of like situation I never thought I would be looking, living in. I live in Latin America, but living in a box among other boxes, right? Meaning like this kind of suburbia that I loathed as a teen. Though Latin America, it's a little different than the suburbia of the United States. Suburbias, plural, but yeah, so now I'm having to really not only integrate, what I was able to deepen as a monk and as just, in serious solitary retreat time, but also look at my practice differently. And I'm mentoring people who, like I said, don't or didn't have that opportunity. And And I'm finding that there are lots of ways to practice. There are lots of ways to deepen. And it all comes down to, for me, I was talking to someone the other day, and it really came down to conviction. These are not only these three, but these three are major, I think, for us: conviction, commitment, and structure. Because I think this is where it gets confused. First of all, it's difficult to develop conviction in deep Dharma, as you know. It's not easy. I mean, you and I, we're similar in a way where I think we got a big hit in the beginning, and then we, so-called. Oh, I hate that crypto took this term away from us. That got red pilled. Like from the Matrix. Where we took I think it's the red pill, right? You take the red pill and then you wake up,
I think so.
you realize you're in the Matrix, right?
Right.
I think it's kind of like that when you have this experience of discovering Buddhism and you have this hit where you're like, wow, this is it for me. Mm-hmm. This is where the wisdom is. This is what I want to explore and use as a structure for my life. And to me, that's a type of conviction. Mm-hmm. For the listeners out there, red pilled also means now that you've seen the light of Bitcoin. That's why I said that. It's become a crypto phrase too. Anyways, no comment there on pro or against crypto. Just want to put that out there, right? It's not a denying or accepting of. But anyways, yeah. So I think that brings a type of conviction, but then we need some commitment based on that conviction. And that commitment, I think, comes from study and understanding of the Dharma and deepening of practice, and connecting to a view, like we were talking about a little bit before we hit record today too. Like, how I see a lot of meditation practice without purpose, or the purpose is kind of a little bit nebulous. It's not so clear. Or people get bored because they're like, they have a limited purpose, and then they sort of reach a limit with that. So I don't know. Yeah, there's kind of just a few thoughts initially on it.
Yeah, the conviction, I think, is a big one. And for me, I think some of what changed was seeing different people's perspectives. Like when I did go to Tibet, and I was around a lot of monks, and I saw that here were my idea going over there was every monk was going to be this holy saint that was going to be into meditation and much better in practice than I was. And I saw monks that were like regular kids and regular people just wearing robes. And, I was just recently reading, something very similar in After the Ecstasy of the Laundry by Jack Kornfield, where he talks about, his teacher telling him that he needed to bow to everybody in the monastery, and the resentment about that, and feeling like, here's this guy that was like a farmer, and he doesn't really care about Dharma at all. He's not even really practicing. Why do I have to bow to him? Just because he's been here for 2 weeks longer than I have, So there is that like illusion sort of shattered of, oh, it's the external thing that is the conviction, rather than that internal commitment to like you said, approach every situation as something that I can apply my practice to. That the life is providing me with these opportunities to practice compassion, to practice patience, to all the things that we try to cultivate and practice. It's right there. I don't have to go somewhere or take a external vow to get that.
The problem I see most, the other side of it is the problem. I think you named it well, because I don't see the problem as the structure, because Dharma is malleable. It can really come into any structure, but the problem is habitual pattern, and the way our afflictive emotions of passion, aggression, and ignorance, function through habitual pattern. And so our habitual patterns are really strong. And I think, I mean, any of us who get excited about the Dharma, we quickly, after that, we hit a wall because we recognize where our actual habitual patterns are at. And then we take on the slow and steady path of, the gradual path of slow and steady, consistent practice, slow and steady working with mind training, trying to work with our habitual patterns. So to me, that's like where the core of the Dharma is. It's in working with our mental states, afflictive emotions, habitual patterns. And then of course that, and I mean, I don't know. I feel like, even needing to say that's in relationship to the world is a little bit, we need to say that now for some reason, because obviously as a practitioner, we all go through phases of becoming very self-absorbed with our practice, but how could that not, the reason I was kind of bringing that up is like, how could that not be in relationship with anything else? Because all of my afflictive emotions, all of my habitual patterns, whether they're positive or destructive, they arise in relation to something else, another person, a situation, a task, work, money, relationship. So it's like those are the things where the Dharma is rich in, and I think so there's a recognition of sort of like, I think for a while we were talking about this in the beginning, but before we hit record, but for me there was this sense, part of it I think was a healthy sense of wanting to discover inner wisdom, at the start of my spiritual journey, spiritual path, and the Dharma and Buddhism. But I think there was also a lot of fantasy and a lot of spiritual materialism, in the sense that I thought, okay, I'm going to go away, and the answer is to leave the relationships or the relation that I was working in. The answer for me at the time was to leave that, and then you find spirituality somewhere else. That spirituality isn't inherent or innate to every situation in life, like what you were bringing up. And I'm not going to say that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that's a step for some of us, right? Like,
Right.
not all of us have to do that, but the Buddha prescribed that. I mean, for a reason, because some of us, our habitual patterns are so strong, we need to go away and explore that fantasy of spiritual materialism, mine the practice a little bit, and then we can come back and integrate it. So for me, that was my path. And like I said, I don't think I would, I'm not saying I'm great at integrating it, not at all, but I don't think I would even have the thought to integrate it if I didn't go away and work a little bit. And going away, we don't truly go away. We're still in relationship to the world, always. That's kind of my point. I don't know if we could ever actually disengage from the world. I think we can create the illusion that we are, like in our own mind, which is a very high form of spiritual materialism. I don't think that's positive. But like I said, it's kind of it's a necessary step for some of us. And then we recognize, well, I can't get out of this. Like, my suffering is pervasive. I can't just will myself out of this. And the more I try to resist, it's like quicksand, the more I go down, So I don't know. That's kind of my relationship to it these days. It's like the more resistance that happens, I just sink further.
Yeah. Well, what you just shared reminds me of like the story of the alchemist, that book where he has to go through that whole journey to finally come back to exactly where he started. The treasure was already there, but he wouldn't have been able to realize that without the journey. The whole thing is a part of that, so whether your path does lead you away, to some sort of monastic or retreat setting, that's a part of your journey. And also, like you said, wherever you go, you're still there. Your mind is still there. Your afflictive emotions and habitual patterns are still there. And, that's I think the real work is to be able to change and integrate those. It's interesting. Like I feel, so myself, like I've been practicing, I would say I've been practicing for 20 years, but like I took a pretty large chunk in the middle where I wasn't like actively doing any practice, actively meditating. I felt like the sort of imprints that had happened from my practice and my experiences like definitely influenced me. You know, it's like
Mm.
if I'm going to the gym for years and years and I suddenly stop going for a few years, like my body doesn't completely lose all the muscle. But
Yeah.
over the last few years, coming back to a regular practice and meditating every day and really pursuing that study and trying to integrate the ideas and sort of guidelines, framework, I guess you could say, of Buddhism into my life. um, One of the things that I'm continuously really really like astounded by sometimes is um, how much I'm still learning, and
Yeah.
like the blind spots and the spiritual materialism and the uh, things that I discover about myself. Like I recently had this moment where I was like, I really had it literally stopped me in my tracks, and I spent days like really digesting the implications of it. I was watching a video with Thich Nhat Hanh, and he was
Mm.
talking about being a young man and thinking or having this belief that the Buddha didn't suffer,
Mm.
and coming to this realization that of course the Buddha suffered because he was a human being.
Mm. Yeah.
And it like struck me like this bolt, of like, oh, I believe that too. I see this, this radiant, like peaceful being, in pictures and tankas and books. And of course he's awakened. So he must not be suffering. He's overcome all that,
Yeah.
instead of it being the way that he's relating to the human experience. And it really took me down this path, not only of going back and re-examining where I've been bypassing certain things, um, but also like really opened, I think, some of the things that I'm still working on in like a very beautiful way,
Yeah.
where it's like, oh, maybe I don't have to be so hard on myself. Maybe I can have more compassion for myself and those parts of me that are suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So
love
there's
that.
just a
Yeah.
lot of I find it really amazing, even though sometimes it's very hard to, like, a hard pill to swallow, to have those moments where I realize the blind spots and the bypassing in myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Same for me. It's a constant, you know, I think of it in a few different ways. In one way, it can be kind of like crushing, not in a negative way, but just sort of like, just wow, kind of like awe mixed with that rawness, like a bittersweetness, you know?
Yeah.
And then in another way, it's very heart opening, because I think when we blend it with compassion from a Buddhist perspective, which is the wish that ourselves and others can be free from suffering and its causes, and then the understanding of suffering is vast. It's not just sort of outer suffering. It's also every moment we're in a bind. We're in a dualistic experience that is the suffering also. And so there's kind of like for me, like a sense of like the heart can break open in those moments, which is the path. That is the Yeah, I hear that in what you're saying. I'm not sure if you're intending that, but that sense of like we're consistently trying to work with the suffering as a heart opening experience. And the moment I resist suffering, my own suffering, whatever, you know, even just sort of like sitting on a couch too long and feeling, like I need to get up. The moment I'm resisting that or struggling with that, my heart closes. I can't open the heart because there's stagnation, there's stuckness, there's resistance, and there's trying to seek happiness on the outside. Or I'm trying to seek some kind of other pleasure or other solution, right? As opposed to just allowing suffering. And so, yeah, I really relate to what you're saying in the sense that, yeah, I kind of think of, I don't know, I constantly am iterating what awakening means to me, because obviously in one way it's very stupid, to think about what awakening is. You know what I mean? Because like it definitely means we don't have it if we have to think about it, and also it's sort of pointless in a way because awakening, at least from the lineages we study in, is not a conceptual thing. It's not a thought. It's not something we can. It's something we can experience, but it's not a conceptual idea. So but I do think there's usefulness in thinking about it because it's also our intention for why we practice,
Yeah.
through bodhicitta, or the mind of awakening. So I had a mentee message me earlier and just say, hey, am I supposed to cultivate the same intention all the time, like for practice? And I'm like, yes and no, because yes, there's this intention of bodhicitta, the wish to attain awakening for the benefit of all beings. And then, but then there's the gray area of like, that's not a, as that unfolds for us, as we cultivate that, as that grows, as our relationship changes and grows towards that over the years of study and practice, that becomes more meaningful, and the vastness of that starts to, we start to connect with the vastness of that intention. So for me, it started like as just reciting a chant, da, 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 and having the words in my mind, and maybe like inspiration towards it, but kind of a vague idea, because sometimes we don't even look back to think about it as beginners, where it's like, oh, like what does that even mean? Awakening, to awaken for the benefit of all beings. What does that even mean? I mean,
Right.
but the problem is we don't know, so we just have to form some kind of intention to start working on it, and then we go on the journey, and then that unfolds, and that the meaning of that grows as our practice is cultivated, and our nature of mind, if we're able to connect with that more and more, in my opinion. So anyways, I guess that's kind of a long way to say it's sort of, yeah, it's this sense of, to me, that, yeah, that was, I realized what I was trying to say through that. I was kind of, reflecting on what you were saying, and then thinking about this sense of that awakening. For me, a way I think about it these days is kind of like, it's not suffering, but it's it's not suffering, or how do you say it? It's not suffering or not suffering. It's sort of, because it's just whatever's in front of us, you know? And
Yeah.
and yeah, it's not like it can be something different. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's coming up for me is like sort of like a radical acceptance of whatever's happening. Like
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we're sort of talking about, or maybe around a little bit, and it's not exclusive to Buddhism. I think it's
No.
really a essential part of like any sort of spiritual work, or real good therapy or psychedelic work, where you go through these sort of stages. Like at first you're like, and this relates to what we started with, right? Of like, I've got to get away from these things that I don't like about myself. And then through that journey, through that pushing away, at some point we start to befriend and have compassion for those parts, instead of trying to disown them. Instead of
Yeah.
trying to get rid of them, we go, oh, this is a part of my experience. This is a part of me. And maybe I can even see what that purpose was for that part at a certain time, and like have gratitude and have compassion for it, instead of being like, ew, this is suffering and this is nirvana. And,
Yeah.
they're two separate things.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And in Vajrayana Buddhism, it gets pointed out directly that awakening itself is beyond both samsara and nirvana. Samsara and nirvana are a duality in themselves.
Yeah.
To be sort of, and that's where I kind of was thinking about this notion of for us on the path, there's nothing but being with our dukkha, and then waking up through that. The dukkha, I don't think, is the awakening, but the nature of reality is part of any of the dukkha we're experiencing. I mean, just in any kind of Madhyamaka or middle way teachings, it's not like emptiness is this other thing. And we
Right.
describe, as the nature of reality. One way to describe it is through the shunyata, or the teachings on emptiness, which doesn't mean nothingness. It just means that we can't. Nothing is findable as a singular, independent, permanent entity, and so emptiness itself is also not findable. So it's like, I think we're always trying to find this thing, because the dualistic mind, we want to find this the spirituality, or the pure experience that's outside of what we're experiencing now. But Buddhism is so radical, because it's like, no, the awakening is in the experience. So it's not like dukkha is the awakening. It's that the nature of dukkha is already awake. The nature of dukkha is emptiness, whatever
Yeah.
that experience is, and the dukkha is my perception. Like, I'm looking around, the, the room I'm in, and it's not anywhere else. And also, awakening is not anywhere else. So it's kind of this simultaneous unfolding. I was thinking this morning, I don't know why this came into my mind, because you mentioned kind of how this is also transcends Buddhism. For sure it does. I was thinking of, like, a lot of people describe spiritual experiences, whether they're on psychedelics or long-term meditation paths or whatever it is, as like oneness, and I was kind of thinking of, like, yeah, I understand why they do that, and but for me, it's not really oneness we're talking about. It's infinity we're talking about.
Mm.
And I think infinity is like the scariest thing in a way, like, as soon as I had that thought, I was like, like, partly I was excited by that, but partly I was like, wow, because I think, yeah, I think, you work with people, right, in psychedelics, and that can be sometimes the experiences. People taste infinity there, and it can be
Right.
very scary. It can be very overwhelming, you know?
Sure. Yeah. It's shattering, of like
Yeah.
all the ideas about who you are and how the world is. And I mean, talk about the red pill, it's like that, that real like visceral ejection from the matrix, like of Neo coming out of that pod and being like, what the heck is this? Like, it's completely alien, um and at the same time, it's always been like that. You're just seeing it, from that perspective for the first time, right?
So that's a beautiful way to put it. Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, that's vital. I think, no pun intended, to think of it like that. Yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah,
like, it's
yeah.
not new. Yeah,
Right. It seems new, and that's that
yeah,
dualistic, sort of idea of like, wait, what's changed? Well, somebody just pulled the veil, from, your eyes, and you're just seeing it that way the whole time. And I think that's an interesting thing about reality as well, is, we base the majority of our reality on, less than 1% of the visible light spectrum, and consider that
yeah,
we are getting the whole picture. And I think there's like a
yeah,
lot of hubris in that, right? And that just thinking about that from a statistic perspective,
yeah,
not to mention that,
yeah. I
like, we
agree.
know that different animals perceive things differently than us, because they're
Yeah,
perceiving different parts of the spectrum, different frequencies. And that's the thing about psychedelics and, meditation and these different practices, is that they open us up to having a bigger transmitter, being able to receive more information. And um yeah, I think hubris is like a really good word. Like, we were talking about, earlier, about these realized Tibetan, Buddhist masters, where there are things happening that don't make sense to you and me, maybe from like a regular sort of life perspective, but they're very real, or
yeah,
not, depending on your viewpoint, and that's okay either way, right? But that was, I think, for me, that some of learning about some of those things was part of that first critical hit, that we were talking about, of the Buddhism in the beginning, was like, oh wow, there's all these other things in reality that I've never heard of, but it seemed really interesting and seemed cool,
yeah.
and seemed like they transcend that mundane experience of me in a cubicle, working, and, just coming home and buying groceries and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's relative, I mean, we were
Yeah.
talking before, and I hope it's okay to mention it in the recording. So you mentioned it in my bio earlier. One of my root teachers died yesterday,
Yeah.
and well, his breath stopped, and his heart stopped. So physically, he died from a Western perspective, but actually, he's in what's called tukdam right now, or meditation.
Right.
Or I'm not sure if it's actually quite tukdam at this point. I think it has to go on for a certain amount of days. So I was thinking of that as you were just talking, because this is a phenomena that a lot of people are shocked by. I mean, a lot of people would just kind of, how do you say, fluff that off as like, oh, that's just like some bullshit or something like that. But actually, now
Right.
there's some documentaries. There's a wonderful documentary called Tukdam, where out of Richie Davidson's lab, who does a lot of studies on mindfulness and the brain. They have a team in India that has done research on meditators who are able to stay in a state of meditation for from 3 days up to a few weeks at a time after death. Which, as you know, but maybe I don't know if the listeners know, is a sign of a very realized meditator in our lineages. And the phenomena from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective is that we have a gross mind and we have a subtlemost mind. And so the subtlemost mind is not dependent upon the physical body, though it's sort of entrenched or in the physical body until the time of death, and then it can leave the physical body and go to another incarnation. But anyways, but the phenomena is kind of like very magical and mystical for us, where for a Tibetan yogi it's just normal, like.
Right.
So my teacher, we don't know all the details, but he apparently took a helicopter up to he was invited by some monasteries, I think, in some villages up high in the Himalayas, and he went up from Kathmandu, and he was experiencing some altitude sickness, and then so they took him back down to his monastery in the Kathmandu Valley at a lower elevation, and his breath stopped, and they tried to resuscitate him but couldn't. And he's an older man, I believe he's in his 70s, and he, anyways, but he wasn't sick. It they don't know if it's connected to the altitude sickness or not, but great yogis can die at will, meaning like they can control when they die. And I don't know if that's the case here. I do believe it is, but nonetheless, his body isn't decaying right now, so he's
Right.
in meditation. So that's a feature of Tukdam. That's kind of the main feature that scientists are studying. How is it possible that the body doesn't decay for a certain amount of days or weeks, and what's happening there? And so they're trying to study it from a brain perspective, but the subtlemost mind is not functioning. Maybe there's some electrical signals happening, but it's not functioning so much with the brain. It's because in Buddhism, the mind is not brain. The brain helps the mind, but there's also
Yeah.
other aspects of mind that don't depend on the brain. But anyway, so it's very real for me. I just watched this amazing documentary called Tukdam like a few weeks ago, and then here's my Lama, one of my main teachers, displaying this right now. I mean, you can go on YouTube and watch him in meditation. And so, but his breath has stopped. So, anyways, yeah, I was just thinking of that as you're talking, because it's when we. Oh, that was my point. For us, they're very like, how do you say it? It's sort of this question of like, what is esoteric, or kind of like beyond knowledge, if we just don't know about it. You know what I mean? It's like,
Mm.
it's like if we just don't understand it, that doesn't mean it's esoteric necessarily. Because
Yeah.
to someone like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, it's not esoteric. It's just he can do that because he's accessed other parts of his mind through meditation, right?
Absolutely. I had this
Yeah.
experience once during an ayahuasca ceremony where I really experienced the so most ayahuasca ceremonies, like traditionally, take place basically in the dark. There might be a
Mm-hmm.
candle or something like that, but it's pretty dark. And most of the way through the ceremony, um, there was a fire lit, and the experience that I had was this very primal, uh maybe not primal is the right word, but like almost like connecting to the ancestral magic of fire,
Mm-hmm.
and realizing what fire would have been like for my very, 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 very early ancestors. And
I see.
realizing because of this intention and because of the magic or the way that, is perceived as magic, um, and how long and how many times human beings have gathered around fire for this very like positive like energetic charge, how that's become healing, why it's still
Mm.
healing now, and experiencing that like just like somebody that had just discovered fire, and then that leading me into this experience of, or this realization of, everything that we consider magic is just science that we don't understand.
Yeah, yeah, that was my
And
point.
the things that, maybe a couple hundred years ago somebody would have, oh, that's magic.
Yeah,
Now we oh, we can put a scientific explanation behind it, and it's not woo woo, or it's not, magic anymore. So how many things that we consider magic or esoteric or, not real, um are around us all the time. We just look at them that way because we don't have the explanation for it. We don't have the science to it. And that's one amazing thing about Tibetan Buddhism and these different wisdom lineages, is there is a science to it. In their own way, it might not be the same Western science, but it's documented, and there's processes and there's frameworks that you can use to access these different things that maybe are not, uh, everybody knows, from a mainstream sort of perspective, but they're science nonetheless. And you could apply
yeah.
that to things like acupuncture, or like you're saying, different meditation practices that now we're able to start to apply science to. And I often bring this up in breath work, for instance, of like, think about that within Chinese, Sanskrit, Greek, and Hebrew, which are all four pretty ancient, traditions and cultures. The word for spirit and the word for breath are exactly the same word. Like there's
Mm.
something that's not a coincidence, right? Like these cultures knew the things that we're just rediscovering now, in terms of being able to use the breath as the way to access these deeper parts of ourself that other people are like, oh, that's just some woo woo magic stuff, that's not real. So
Yeah,
there's so much magic in the world.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And as you said, it's sort of magic is just often what we can't understand,
Yeah.
or relate to in the structure. And Buddhist magic, or Vajrayana lineage magic, is, or as you said, sort of the practices and structure of it's just based on subjective science, not objective science. So that's
Yeah.
it's something repeatable by meditators, through a lineage and through time. And I think that is where we put our, both research and development, over 2,600 years, and also we put our faith or in that. And for other people that might be like a form of blind faith, because they're like, oh well, you didn't experience it directly, or you can't prove that objectively. But we do have these instances where we kind of can, because look at some of these meditators, who are science has no idea what's going on, how the body cannot decay for weeks, basically. And so they're trying. So again, it's one of these things where now it's being studied, which is good. But also for me, I don't need them to study it. I
Right.
like you know in a way, culturally, I feel modern Western culture is in deep, deep shit. It has been for a while. And, there's so many signs that we are in need of a drastic reboot, a drastic reboot. And I mean, so many of us are feeling that. And the problem is, that, a lot of people, I think the fear that comes out of seeing that need, um, drives violence and aggression, unfortunately. So, we're in this kind of crux where, is that drastic reboot going to happen through violence or not? And I really hope it doesn't happen through violence, but it's happening. We're in the midst of it. There's just no doubt. And I think part of it is just in a way, the second wave of psychedelics in the West, or you could say in the modern West, because psychedelics always existed in Western cultures, in shamanic or root earth based traditions in Western culture. But this kind of second wave, from the '60s on, you really look at the first wave of psychedelics in the West, it brought in Eastern religion. Like the reason you and I have access to Buddhism is probably because of psychedelics,
right,
in the '60s, right? It opened people's minds enough that they were open to other ideas and open to all these other practices and philosophies. And then the teachers could start to come, and the traditions could start to come. And then now we're in the second wave, which I think is, we don't know yet what it's all about, but part of it I think is this kind of drastic response to a culture in deep distress and deep suffering. Anyways, probably you know more about that than I do, but I just wanted to share that perspective.
Yeah, no, I think it's true, and I was talking to somebody recently, and there was a curiosity that they had brought up about what happens when or as the students that have become teachers from that first wave, as they're getting old and they start to die.
Yeah.
And my reflection on that was, there are new students coming that are, maybe more appropriate to the time that we're in. And it's amazing, one of those first wave teachers, right, was Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who is one of those teachers for me that started to make me see those blind spots in my own practice by reflecting on what he was teaching, and was not, sort of the I think a good sort of metaphor or symbol for what we're talking about in terms of psychedelics or Buddhism, where we might go into it thinking that we're going to get all peace and love and blissed out, and instead we just get smacked upside the head by the reality of life. And then thinking about, okay, well, right now I'm studying with one of his students, David Nichtern, and then there's also Pema Chodron, who's two radically different teachers from the same teacher, but the way that they teach is radically different, and yet they're still teaching the same thing. They're still teaching the same Dharma. And thinking, and I said, well, think about how many students just those two students of Chogyam Trungpa had. That's just two of them, and how many students they've been training and have been studying with them, and who's the next person that's going to come out of that we're going to say, oh, that's the next Pema Chodron or something like that, even though there can be no next Pema Chodron, right? Everybody's unique. But I think you get what I'm saying. This thing that I've David said this during one of our lectures that I thought was really interesting. He said, the recipe is the same for over 2,600 years. It's just, we're just passing down the same recipe, but you have to make it. If I hand you a recipe, it's not going to feed you. And I've used that metaphor myself, just to think about how the Buddhist Dharma has changed in these slight different ways depending on the cultures that it goes into. It might change a little bit because there's the ingredients in that country or that culture are a little bit different, but the recipe is still the same. Almost there were Arabs that emigrated into parts of Mexico and were cooking shawarma, and that became El Pastor, right? Which is
Yeah.
like almost the same, but not, it's got little bits of difference, you know?
Yeah.
I've always found that fascinating about, but, and yet the recipe is still the same. We're just trying to figure it out in maybe modern context. And yet it's amazing to me that things that happened 2,600 years ago, 1,000 years ago, are still so relevant and vital and like vibrant to this day.
Yeah.
You know, it's incredible.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, our fundamental human predicaments have not changed. And
Yeah.
so, that's where I don't think the Dharma of the Buddha from 2,600 years ago has to change, because
Yeah.
it's the fundamental predicaments are the same. And when we were able to free ourselves, so to speak, from those fundamental predicaments, that's the point, like that, that's the point. And I think, yeah, and I think the clothes can change. I mean, that's kind of how I think of it, is like the clothes can change, but the fact that we need to wear clothes doesn't change. And, like, and
Yeah.
so, but the clothes can change and styles can change. But there are the, like you said, there's these recipes and components that when those change, and if they change enough, it ceases to be dharma. So I think there is some real thought that needs to be put into this. Whenever Buddhism has been transferred from one culture to another, I think it took a lot of time, first of all, and
Yeah.
it took a lot of care, and a lot of iterations, like within that.
Uh-huh.
Like, just the one I know, which is Tibetan Buddhism, or know of it through reading about it. It's over hundreds and hundreds of years, and multiple periods of translation, and development, and lots of teachers coming over from India to help with that. And yeah, I really have hope that we can do it in the West. I have my kind of doubts as well, but a meaning. Um, um, we're not very humble culturally.
Mm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
you were naming like hubris as a
Yeah.
thing. Hubris is a pretty major obstacle to receiving something. I mean, even just, we need to have the idea that we're receiving something. That doesn't mean, like, how do you say it? Receiving something doesn't mean that it's a given. Like, meaning, it's a gift that we're receiving something. It's not like a guarantee, right? It's not like something that we deserve necessarily. I mean, you could say, like, we all deserve dharma, like every sentient being. So that, I don't mean it like that. I mean it more like, how do you put it? Yeah, I guess I'll just go back to my main idea, which is, yeah, I think there needs to be more humility around it. And the humility, it is really of just like, for me, my take is sort of just like, sit down for a while, try to absorb it, and if we have some words of wisdom that we develop out of our practice, we can share with others, that's fine. But there's no need to like reinvent it. I mean, it'll naturally come out of a human experience when one has, churned and transformed and sort of cooked oneself through the Buddhist path. Naturally, that's going to come out. So I just don't even worry too much about the need to make it new or relatable or whatever, because I think, like, how could it not be relatable if we're practicing? Like, if you and I are practicing, and then we're sharing with someone who studies with us, or a coachee or mentee or whatever, it's like, how could it not be relatable? Because anything, if we have the humility to understand, like, it has to come through our experience, and that our experience is still developing, we don't have all the answers, and we're trying to receive it, understanding, it's not about putting a Tibetan or a Thai monk or Vietnamese monk or nun or whatever. It's not putting anyone on a pedestal. It's about, being an apprentice, because this is something that I think is familiar to Western culture, or was in Europe. Apprenticeship, you don't go to the the person you're apprenticing with and just like demand everything and then argue with them about the meaning, or tell them they're right or wrong in certain things. You just try to take it in, have your own experience. You might have all kinds of opinions, but you just work with it, you know. So you sit with it, and then so in a way, I mean, there's a lot I could say about it, but maybe I don't want to keep ranting. But it's
No, man, go for it.
it's something that is vital. Where and it's tricky too, because like a lot of us apprentice to then turn it around and make money with it. So that's not the kind of apprenticing I'm talking about. But of course, that can be included, because like if we're trying to serve others, we also need, this. We were talking about this earlier, of like trying to serve others through spirituality and meditation and all that. If we don't have our basic needs taken care of, like how are we going to deepen our work and even have the time to offer it? Because then we have to do something else to provide for our basic needs. I mean, this is kind of a hot button issue, because it can happen different ways. It's not like there's one way to do this, but I think the model of apprentice for a very short amount of time to then go out and make a buck on it, I think that's a little bit skewed. But anyways, it's kind of, I know it's tricky.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think some of it comes back to intention. I know we touched on that earlier, but also like, I guess how I'm relating to what you just shared is, I see this a lot within the psychedelic context of people that go out and they have, a peak experience, like a really strong experience. Yeah. And then their immediate response to that is, I should be serving the medicine. I should be working with the medicine. I should be giving this to others. And that this is the answer is through that. And while I admire their enthusiasm, I'm always like, do you realize by doing that, you're actually like making your life much more difficult, because you have to like constantly do your own work. Like you've given up the option of saying, I'm going to take a break from this. This isn't for me. Like, I've been really touched recently by this story in The Wisdom of No Escape by Pema Chodron, where the story of this woman that wants to, she starts asking people, how do I become enlightened? And somebody says, well, there's this old woman in the mountains, and if you go and ask her, she'll tell you how to get enlightened. And this woman says, okay, I'm going to do that. Yeah, this is for me. And of course, goes through this arduous journey of going through the mountains to find this cave, and finally finds the cave, and goes in, and there's this beautiful woman in all dressed in white, very serene, sitting there, and she prostrates before the woman and says, teach me to be enlightened. How do I become enlightened? The woman says, are you sure? And she says, yes, of course, teach me. And the woman then like turns around and becomes this demon with this giant stick and starts chasing her with the stick, saying, now. And for the rest of the woman's life, there's this demon chasing her saying, now, and this like wonderful metaphor of the story of like, once you get to a certain place, you can't really turn it off. You can't say like, oh, I'm just going to like ignore all these things that I've learned and that I've integrated into my life, especially if you're serving others. Like it's, you have to keep doing your work. Otherwise the suffering and the humanness can easily overtake you. And we see that so much, in terms of ethical violations within these different spaces, where people forget that, or maybe they're not doing their own work. And then, the humanity comes in, right? Of like, sexual misconduct, these various misconducts. And so I'm always really cautious, of like, well, that's a great idea. Like, yeah, you want to serve the medicine, you want to serve others, you want to be on this path. That's wonderful. You got to go and do your own work first, so that you can hold space. you know?
Yeah, yeah, and at least I mean, I don't think that, we have to wait till our work is finished, so to
Right,
speak,
right,
to
right.
serve others.
Definitely.
But but I agree with you, and I think there's a lot of confusion on what that looks like,
Mm.
because in the beginning we often don't know how to distinguish between a spiritual ego trip and and an actual genuine moment of insight, because
Yes.
in our lineage, Tibetan Buddhist lineages, we don't take moments of insight that seriously.
Mm.
We call
Hmm.
them meditation experiences,
Right.
meaning something that comes, experience of bliss or experience of clarity, or sometimes non-thought, or even just some wisdom of like into the nature of reality a little bit. um, you know Maybe I've been fortunate because I've just had teachers who, like, every time I came to them with some half-baked idea of like, oh, this happened and blah, what do you think, they're just like, they just ignored the shit out of me. And it was the
Yeah.
best teaching ever. I'm so thankful I have those experiences, because they just ignored me. I mean, it was a bit tough. I don't do that with students. I let students know that's a meditation experience. Like, great, means you're practicing, but keep going. Like, don't take it too seriously. But
Right.
my ego is strong enough that I needed kind of more of a smackdown from my teachers. It's a little more of a Tibetan style too. And so they just ignore me and they just be like, what are you talking about? But it was just really helpful because it helps us to tamper that and recognize. Because, like I was saying, with this recent passing in the last few days of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, it sort of like shows also this way to work with life and death, where it's just sort of, you're just working with it, and it's not like, he didn't make a big deal about his death. He didn't like make a big now I'm going to die, and watch me meditate, while I'm dead. Like, he didn't make some big show of it. It just happened. And so that kind of natural, even my other root teacher, I called him because I was really sad, and he's friends with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and I said, Zopa Rinpoche, I said, Rinpoche, wow, Lama Zopa Rinpoche just died. What happened? He said, yeah, I was with him 10 days ago doing pujas, and yeah, I was kind of shocked at first. And he said, but that's impermanence. That's just how it is. So, like, his response was compassionate towards me because he understand I just lost a teacher, but also it was a teaching in and of itself. It was just like a short WhatsApp message, but it was a teaching of like, of course, man, like, of course, Scott, this is the way it is. Like, it's not a big
Right.
deal. He'll come back. He's just transferring out of this body. So it's like,
Hmm.
almost like, this is something I've never seen in Western culture personally. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
it exists, just not in the modern Western culture I've had access to. Is through the mirroring I experience with the wisdom of I consider Tibetan culture to be an indigenous culture. The
Hmm.
mirroring of that. So there's so much more. Going back to our conversation on receiving the Dharma over time with humility, there's so many lessons we need to learn beyond the philosophy of Dharma, beyond the words and even the practices. There's so much that gets mirrored just through the embodiment of it in other practitioners. And I'm really praying, that more and more Western practitioners become realized, because then we'll also have something more familiar to us culturally of how it looks to be embodied and awake. Where I think right now we just have a lot of hubris. I don't know. The problem is the people who are embodied and awake, they often don't have the hubris, so they're not, they're harder to make contact with. So there is that, right? So they're probably out there. But what I see kind of is more kind of the hubris in the culture. I see both, actually, to be fair. But anyways, just, yeah, that point of having that mirror, that's just like how simple some of these things are, and we come, and all of that to me is a result of ego clinging being less. Like I think, when I, similar to your story about the psychedelic, when I hear someone come to me and say, Mother Aya told me this, and I'm like, dude, like, please leave me alone. Like, I don't mean that in
Right.
like a harsh way, but it's just like, the people I know who've gone deep in those traditions, who've spent time in the Amazon jungle in Colombia or other countries, they don't act like that. They're not going around
Right.
proclaiming Mother Aya did this or that. They just you know, again, I don't necessarily think psychedelics is a path in and of itself, but in these indigenous traditions, they have their purpose, they have paths.
Right. Yeah.
And I know a few people who have gone quite deep in that, and they're not flashy people about it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Often, actually, a shaman, someone I know work with a lot, who is an indigenous shaman from Colombia. He doesn't even know how he is. You know, he's like, she describes him as very, very humble and very skilled at the work he does with people, the healing work he does, right?
Right.
Um, and you know, he's so oblivious to his own talent because he's so humble, you know. And he said, and so she often comments, those are the kind of people, you know, I mean, in Dharma it's slightly different who we're looking for, but nonetheless, I think the qualities are similar, and like those are the kind of people we want to look towards, as people to apprentice with. But again, it's like, how does that look for us culturally? We don't know. I don't know yet, you know. Like a
Yeah.
loudmouth, you know, someone, it doesn't mean they don't have those qualities. It's sort of tricky, you know.
Yeah. Uh, well, for me, there's an interesting, um, to kind of go back to, like, sort of making a living from, a spiritual sort of career or, job. Um, there was an interesting thing when I remember the first time that my partner said, you should be teaching meditation. And I said, to who? And she said, do you realize that, like, most people haven't been meditating for as long as you have? And the bewilderment for me partially came from being taught by these, I consider them realized masters that, like, do have these powers and do have these esoteric things, and yet will sit there and tell you, I don't really know what I'm talking about. I'm just a monk, or I'm just a guy, and
Yeah,
you're like, bullshit. Like, I've seen it. I've experienced this thing, but they're going to sit there and be like, I'm not that special, so
yeah,
it's like, if somebody that obviously has that much realization is sitting there modeling that level of humility, what right do I have to put my toe in the arena? That's how I looked at it coming into it. I think the other thing that came up for what you're saying is, um, maybe
yeah.
maybe
Just real quick, I
something
just
that.
want to say, so there's a heavy cultural element there. I want to talk on that, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we can pause right there and keep going with that. Yeah.
Oh no, I don't want to interrupt you if you had.
Oh, the other thing that I wanted to, like, kind of reflect on what you said is, I feel like what I've noticed is that, at least within America, um, oftentimes the thing that's, like, attracting people to different Buddhist teachers is, like, um, more what you would call advanced teachings, like going to Vajrayana tantric empowerments,
Yeah,
without necessarily getting the foundation, of, like, within a traditional sort of path of study and meditation. You're learning all these different foundational things, things like meditating on the impermanence of everything, including yourself, meditating on just the preciousness of a human life, and, like, being able to muster that into something meaningful. um all these different sort of, within the Buddhist path, called the gradual path, or,
mm-hmm.
the steps on the path, so that you can actually, like, really utilize and integrate these quote unquote higher teachings, right? And
Yeah,
that people are just oftentimes jumping in to those higher teachings, those empowerments, without that knowledge, and then maybe not getting the most benefit out of it because of that. um
yeah.
so it's interesting to me there. I think that we would benefit from maybe taking it a little bit slower. um And also, like, I feel like a truth for me is that all of these practices, regardless of whether they're preliminary or basic or higher practices, like, they're only so useful if you're only able to use them when things are going good. Like, it's easy for me to, like, be all full of love and light if everything in my life is going well.
Yeah.
But how am I able to use those resources when the shit hits the fan?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and that's something that, like, I've long considered of, like, a beautiful teaching of Tibetan Buddhism is, like, you find out, like, how much you've integrated when, like, in the face of adversity, because ultimately,
Yeah.
like, that's kind of what these practices are for,
Yeah, yeah, and I think as I was saying earlier in our conversation, I think there's often, you know, for me, whether we're working with the foundational practices in Buddha Dharma or the more fruitional kind of Vajrayana practices, or just sort of general Mahayana, studying emptiness or working on analytical meditation or whatever. Um, they all we the reason why we're doing it has to be cultivated,
Yeah.
and we describe that as the view of why we're engaging in meditation in the first place. And the view is an expanding exploration in Buddhism. It's not a singular thing like, yep, oh, okay, like, let me read a paragraph on that. Okay, got it, that's the view, let's do it. It's like that's just the start, where we get kind of some idea of like why we're doing this, or why we might do this. And I think sometimes we don't like that because we want to make it original, or we want to make it kind of like our own. And you know the problem with that is, like, usually we just follow our own ego trip. We just follow our own self-absorbed attitude of why we're doing something. So the Dharma is there. I call it a two-way mirror, or like where it's kind of like I have or it's just a mirror where we're using the Dharma, we're using the study of the view of why we meditate in Buddhism to look back at our own habitual patterns. And I think this is kind of the crux of it for a lot of people, because usually what they're reacting to when they want to be like, hey, I want to explore my truth, man, kind of thing, it's usually a resistance to belief. It's a resistance to religious belief. And without the recognition, when we use the Dharma as a mirror, we don't have to use it as a belief system. We just use it as a system of looking back at our own beliefs and patterns. So I think part of the problem with hubris is there's not even a recognition that we have beliefs in the first place. There's not enough introspection into, like, oh, I have fixed ideas, I have biases, I have limiting beliefs, I have beliefs. And in a way, I would say, like, what isn't a belief in our life? From my perspective, everything is a belief. And so the Buddha Dharma kind of gives us a view or a perspective that we grow and we cultivate, and we kind of our understanding of and our relationship to, as a way, as a belief, an alternative belief, initially, but it's an alternative belief to question belief in itself, to go beyond belief. That's what I love so much about Buddha Dharma. So it's kind of like, tying it into what we've been talking about. You asked me about this in the beginning of the call. That's why I made this kind of post or video that I think meditation techniques in and of themselves are dead ends, because they don't lead anywhere, because there's no purpose in them, or the purpose is limited because it hasn't, we haven't incorporated another way to question our own ideas about ourselves and the world, right? And yeah, I think if one just wants to go ahead and question, that's great. Like, that's a wonderful way to work, of just opening up a mind of curiosity, openness, and questioning in general. But I don't know, like, for me personally, and again, this isn't about anyone else, if I didn't have some things to go off of, like that, the Buddha discovered, and basically ideas to explore or questions to explore, I would have never thought of those questions, because they're just too deep. I would have never, initially, I would have never, and that's just me. Maybe I'm just dumb. I don't know. But, I never would have done that. Where, so it's kind of this, I don't know, it's this treasure map. That's how I view the Dharma, where we're kind of like, we're reading about it, we're kind of contemplating it, and then we're engaging in a practice based off of that idea, and then we actually can see it for ourselves. We can go to the treasure site and excavate the treasure to a certain degree. And for me, that's like so powerful because it also goes beyond belief. It goes beyond religion at a certain point, you know?
I think that's the nail on the head for me, because earlier we were talking about like faith or like lack of doubt. And for me,
Yeah.
that's where that comes from, is like, like my partner's asked me before, like, well, how can you so easily believe X, Y, and Z about Tibetan Buddhism? And I'm like, because I've experienced it. And there's a difference between thinking about something and questioning it and have curiosity and having this mental process up here of trying to like cognitively put the pieces together and experiencing something. Because in
Yeah.
the experience, there's absolutely no doubt. You're just there. And even that, sometimes there's an unpacking and there's an integrating over time, but there's something there that's, I guess, to tie it back to what we were talking about before, is like, um, it goes beyond concepts. You can't really put it into words, but you feel it, you know it
Yeah.
because you've experienced it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think, for me, that's where, when people come to me confused in their meditation, I don't point them to another technique. I mean, I may introduce some embodiment practices and things like that to get out of the thinking mind a little bit and to get more into awareness. But I usually eventually point people to the cultivation of a view, and that doesn't mean I need people to be Buddhist or, I
Right.
want to push Buddhism on anyone. It just
Yeah.
means like at some point we have to choose some kind of a view that actually has some truth in it, and we need to weigh or kind of like play squash ball or ping pong between our beliefs and assumptions and what that's telling us, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, we're doing this in the world anyways all the time, but we're usually just doing this from a very, very limited, myopic, judging mind, of like we see a little clip on something and immediately we make a judgment and we shut down our mind. So, for me, the whole key to happiness, religious or not, or spiritual or not, is curiosity,
Yeah.
because it's just, you asked me about that in the beginning. It's just sort of the sense of like where we don't live in conclusion all the time. And so for me as a practitioner, I use the Buddhist path to help me to not live in conclusion as much. That doesn't mean everyone has to use the Buddhist path, but I think it's helpful and it saves time to use something, to help us investigate in a deeper way. What I call like, yeah, non-conclusion based living, not living in conclusion all the time. It's just, it's so tricky, including like the extreme is in our own lineages as well, right? You can see people get so obsessed with being a Tibetan Buddhist, they can't see out of that framework, you know. And for me, it's sort of, again, we have a phrase actually in the lineage, in the tradition, for talking about this, where you say, don't lose the conduct and the view, and the view and the conduct. And what this means is when we lose the view and the conduct, it's a kind of Puritanism where we're too focused on the parts and the container of something. We're not using the container to question and to be curious. And when we lose the conduct and the view, it means we become sort of nihilistic in a way. We don't we're not using enough of a structure. That's what I said in the beginning. To me, it's sort of first developing some amount of conviction in something through exploration and curiosity, not through blind belief, obviously. Then committing to that, and then cultivating that commitment based in a structure, which would be the conduct kind of element, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the structure of how we live and what we do. But if we like adhere to that structure as puritanical, we totally lose the openness and the curiosity of it. But if we don't have any structure at all, there's no, it's just wishy-washy, and there's no progress that can be made. So I see this as kind of like fundamental things that when meditators are struggling and they come to me for help, often these things are missing.
If I'm following you, it's kind of like jazz, like where jazz might seem so chaotic, but really there's a discipline and like a knowledge and a practice of these fundamentals and these frameworks for a period of time, so that the rules don't have to be followed in the same way, so that you can be free flowing and, seem like you're completely improvising. And when, if a beginner that never had done that fundamental practice was doing that, they would just be banging on the keys and it would be noise.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I use that example a lot of jazz because, yeah, a lot of people kind of mistake jazz for that. I mean, it depends on the type of jazz, but mistake it to be sort of free. It's actually not that free. It's just a bunch of different patterns reorganized in a different way, and then the player has the freedom to like organize those and respond to the moment. And for me, that's like going back to our discussion on dharma and integration into modern day householder life. For me, that's where the creativity is. I've been writing a little bit on creativity and dharma recently, and there's the creativity is not in making it new, in my belief. The creativity is in the freedom in how we want to respond in the moment, through freshness, through openness. Because like when there's less preoccupation of like what I should do or shouldn't do, or like looking out for self, basically. By should and shouldn't, I don't mean like harming or harm or not harm. I mean how I'm interacting as a self, as a fixed person. When we let that go a little bit, we just respond. And so we have to like learn to trust that more. And there's some creativity in that response. And what I mean by trust that is we have to trust that we will conduct ourselves compassionately from that space. And we also make mistakes, and sometimes we don't. And then we're like, oh shit, I just messed up. Oh, I'm really sorry. Okay. And then we look back, we come back, we gather ourselves, we keep working with the structure, and we try again. But there's something in that creativity which I think for me holds the conduct and the view of non-duality in union together, where the conduct should be compassion, but if compassion's always fixated on how am I going to look here, or how am I going to do the best job possible, that's not compassion from my perspective. That's self-absorption. So the compassion is actually, what does this person need in this situation, or what does this situation require? And sometimes we just have to leap in. I mean, Trungpa Rinpoche talked a lot about that. Basically, I'm pulling this straight from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and it's vital as a householder practitioner, because we're constantly in situations and navigating conversations and relationships, and being annoyed at our partners and families, and them being annoyed at us, and being super happy with them too, and all kinds of emotions. And so I think there has to be a lot of freshness and generosity in not trying to bring ourselves into the situation all the time, but showing up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I was having this conversation yesterday, and if I'm following you, so please, if
Sure.
let me know if I'm not. But I was having this conversation yesterday, like expressing frustration about, I guess, the struggle that I feel sometimes trying to follow the bodhisattva path and taking the high road and like being the bigger person, because there's a part of me that wants that treatment in return. And so when I'm put into a situation where somebody is like mistreating me or acting like a child, and I want to respond in kind, there's a part of like, there's a real gut reaction of fuck you, like I want to stoop to their level. I want to like retaliate in that way. And then that might be happening in my head, but something externally says, no, you got to take the high road. You have to be the bigger person here. And then like there's when that's happened to me, there's like this real fighting sometimes of like,
Yeah.
I don't want to do that. I want to, just for once, I want to like, react in that same way. And so it's hard sometimes to like really walk the walk. It's easy to
Yeah.
like, it's easy to talk the talk, right? It's easy to read it in a book and be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be a bodhisattva. But sometimes the human aspect of it sucks.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And that's where it's challenging. And I think, the way I'm changing in how I look at this too. So I just want to put that out there first, that I'm not set on my idea around this, but this is the current way I'm thinking of it. I think coming at this notion of what a bodhisattva is a bodhisattva is beyond what most of us can imagine a person can be.
Right.
And so that's the first thing, is sort of like just not assuming we know what a bodhisattva is, myself included. And then the second thing is that I don't think a bodhisattva is trying to be, so it like brings this whole other question of like, how do we respond? How does one respond? And let's say like a bodhisattva being someone who's free from their own delusion. How do they respond when there's no bodhisattva there? There's no sort of sense of something being personal to them. How are they responding from that? And I think that's the richer, more interesting question, because then we can be like gentle on ourselves, because of course we're going to flounder, because we're stuck in our ego clean most of the time.
Yeah.
And so we're like, that's what I meant. So you did hone in on what I was trying to say, I think, which is that, we're constantly trying to navigate our relationships through our own limited view of ourselves and our perception. But as soon as we recognize that's not fucking working anymore, then we start to experiment with another way. Of course, this requires meditation and development of shamatha and vipassana practice, no doubt, in my opinion, right? But at some point, we got to take a leap, and I recommend doing it in moments that have less what do you call it? Less risk or consequence,
Yeah.
Like at first, I highly recommend that. But we just take the leap. I recommend it actually just with ourselves first, in relation to our own emotions. This is something so beautiful that, in Sokhna Rinpoche's teachings, that have really helped me, of sort of working with embodied practices of just allowing feeling and emotion to arise, and not trying to control them, not trying to dictate what they should be or not be, and just allowing that, heart of just that rawness to be open, which is very challenging with some emotions for me. But
Yeah.
but that practice in and of itself is kind of a way we can work internally, where we don't have to like there's consequences, but the consequences are less, because we're not we're not necessarily going to make a mistake in relation to someone else as quickly. So the risk is lower. But yeah, so I kind of recommend people first do that kind of thing, working with their own emotions. And what I'm really talking about here is we're leaping into a sense of not having to control anymore. And I think the fear is, if we don't control, it's going to get out of control, or if we don't control, we're going to suffer more. And I think we have to break through that fear by trying something different. In this case, Trungpa Rinpoche call it in his book Work, Sex, Money. He calls it like leaping into kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but like leaping into the freshness of the moment, like leaping into the freshness of the situation. And what he means by that is just letting go of trying to like control and outthink the situation, so to speak. Yeah, and so my take, I'm not a bodhisattva, nor do I really have any idea of what a bodhisattva is.
Exactly.
I know on paper, like what the books say, but I think a bodhisattva is living that experience full time, 24/7, and they're responding from that experience. Yeah. So you could see here, bodhicitta is actually not even bodhicitta. Loving kindness is based on kindness. Compassion is based on loving kindness, and then bodhicitta is based on compassion, and all three of those. But compassion being the fundamental aspect of what happens to a mind that's free, it's also free to express compassion without limits, because there's no sense of like having to use the ego to navigate a relationship or a situation with someone. And so the bodhisattva's compassion is also free of limits of what that needs to look like, because all it cares about, all it responds to, is what's needed in the situation. It's not responding to, what I think it needs, or what the bodhisattva thinks it needs. You know what I'm saying? Again, being careful.
I do. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And what you were describing with your teachers, what he was saying in terms of like being able to feel the emotion has been such a game changer for me in the last few years. And that's another one of those like blind spots that I've had to like confront and have that like that moment, of like, why do I feel like why am I having an internal guilt trip because this is what I think I should be doing, or this is how I should be reacting, or that there's something wrong with me because I do feel anger, or I feel hurt, I feel upset, and I'm not full of this idealist, unconditional love and compassion for every single person around me, just allowing myself to be messy and human and like feel the emotion and be in the moment.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I want to make it clear also, I was not trying to call myself a bodhisattva in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I don't know if the listeners, I didn't get that. I didn't get that perspective. I didn't get that from you, but yeah, I think bodhisattva now, the word is getting a little bit misused, not by you here, but I'm concerned because the word is starting to describe someone, people are using the word in a way it's not intended, which is someone who helps people. Someone who helps people is wonderful. Like we should all aspire for that. We should all aspire to help each other, to be kind, to work towards justice for each other, to work towards like better situations for humanity and everyone who shares this world with us. That doesn't define a bodhisattva though. So that's where I think it's tricky, because it doesn't demean someone because they're not a bodhisattva. You see what I'm saying? Like, but a bodhisattva is someone who's realized emptiness. They no longer have any connection to a fixed, dualistic experience of self and other. They've removed that illusion is gone, and so it's another level what they're functioning on. So I think and again, in a way, like some people would argue, well, what does it matter if we words matter? Like how we use terms matter, because when we could lose that relationship to the path if we start to use this term bodhisattva to represent just a helper or a kind person. But I understand for some people's concern is they want to help to foster the idea that we can all become more helpful, kinder, more compassionate. But I don't know. I don't even consider that necessarily like a spiritual or Buddhist thing. That's just like a human thing.
Oh,
we
absolutely.
should all be aspiring to that. So I think, yeah, and it's almost like that's a requirement for a bodhisattva, but a bodhisattva's gone a little further. So, anyways, just a little sidebar, but it's kind of one of my pet peeves lately, because I'm seeing the word bodhisattva being used out of context. And
it kind of goes back to like what we were talking about like the shamans, that like the real shamans aren't going around being like, I'm a shaman, like no. I would imagine that the real bodhisattvas aren't going around doing that either. They're too busy being whatever that means, right? Like it reminds me of like the Taoist saying, like the Tao that can be spoken isn't the real Tao,
Yeah.
It's just the being. It doesn't have anything to do with the labels or
I think I heard recently one Tibetan Buddhist teacher, one Lama, say like, you're much more likely to find a bodhisattva at like a football game than at a Buddhist center. And I don't know if I completely agree with that, but the sentiment of it, of it, I agree with. Yeah.
Well, it's in the moments. Maybe it's in the being. Like there's like this famous like saying from Mr. Rogers that his mom said, like, look for look for the helpers in like the, the paramedics or the people comforting the crying child. So it's not, it's like in these moments. And just like we were talking about earlier, I don't think we named it directly, but I feel like we were dancing around it, that enlightenment is possible, but it's not permanent. We go
Yeah.
back to that state of humanness, and we can experience these moments. Perhaps we could say the same thing about this bodhisattva concept of like, it's possible for us to have these moments of it and then come back to our sort of human experience, and yet also acknowledging that there are people, beings that have reached a permanent state of it, where they're in that state all the time.
Yeah, and this is beyond kind of our imagination right now of
Yeah.
how we think someone could be, because I think it's hard to imagine, like, how does one function outside of the idea of oneself, right?
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
right, like I don't know about you, like all day long everything's in relation to me, you know
Right.
which basically is admitting I'm an ego clinging 24/7 pretty much. And so, you know uh but just to say, part of our path is the recognition of that. Like, if we don't recognize that, how are we going to go beyond it? At some point we have to recognize. I would say for me that's a painful thing to recognize. It's not like I like saying that out loud as a truth, but it's just that's how it is. And how do I know that? Because I see how my mind's, I have enough awareness to see how my mind's interacting with things, you know and
Yeah.
so yeah, so it's kind of this big question of, like, I think that's the conundrum. That's the we were describing it earlier a little bit. That's the challenge of the path. Is we can't think our way into it. It's just
Right.
something that we have to release and release and release, and then at some point that release becomes, permanent, or beyond permanent and permanent.
Yeah. Letting go of
I
this concept of addition and realizing it's even more about subtraction, of just letting go, and
Yeah,
yeah, kind of coming back to that center.
exactly. Yeah, and it's sort of just, for me, every time there's resistance, I know I'm not releasing something, and so you know, I have to lean into that. And then, of course, as a in our tradition, we're also studying and getting familiar with, like, well, what are we releasing into? And I'm kind of saying we're not releasing into anything whatsoever, but we're not just surrendering to anything. We're surrendering to the spaciousness of emptiness. So we kind of need to get familiar with that too. Otherwise, we can miss the mark of what we're surrendering into. So, there's, like, it's both very open and wide open, and also, like, strangely specific in a way. You know what I mean? Like, for
Yeah.
me, I don't know about other people, but that's kind of how I relate to it. It's like, but that specificity gets less and less conceptual the more we practice. You know what I mean? So it's not like,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I got, I didn't realize we'd go on so long. I got another meeting, man. I'm
Oh,
enjoying
cool.
this so
Yeah, no,
much.
that's
Yeah,
awesome. Yeah, it's been great. So before we wrap up, do you have any I think you have a new program coming up, or how can people
I
connect with
do.
you if they want to learn more or work with you?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I do. I've been running I do one-to-one mentoring. I've been doing that for a long time. I also teach, public talks everywhere. People can go to my website to check it out. But yeah, the last 3 months I've been running a group mentoring program as something like distinct from both my public Dharma teaching and my one-to-one work. And it went really, really well with a group of about 13 people, very intimate. And so I decided to just make this an ongoing program where, kind of, people come in as a community, and I'm able to offer mentoring to people in a community format, but with a lot of depth of digging into the Dharma. So yeah, that's gonna the registration for that will open up in the end of May, but people can go to my website, scotttusa.com, click on the mentoring section and read more about it, and sign up for like a pre-launch list if they want to join. Yeah.
Awesome. We'll definitely put that on the show page. Scott, thank you so much. And I think it's a sign of a good conversation that we just kind of kept flowing and kept going. And Just a pleasure to reconnect with you.
I agree. Yeah, thanks so much, man, for asking me to come. And yeah, I agree. I feel like we just got to like the middle of it, and we could just,
Yeah.
so as you said, it's a good sign. Yeah, I appreciate all your wisdom you shared. I really, really appreciate
Well, I thank you for saying that. I'm not sure how much wisdom there was, but yeah, just, I think it's beautiful, like sharing our experience. And I feel like I learned a lot just listening to you as well. There were some definite points where I'm like, oh, I'm gonna go back and listen to that and kind of like digest it a little bit more, because there was like a lot of richness in it. And so yeah, I just appreciate you sharing.
Thanks so much, man. I really appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this episode, thank you so much. If you could share it with somebody else that you think would enjoy it as well, that would be very helpful. We're still building the podcast, it's still a growing, developing entity and spirit. And so, if you're enjoying it, share it with somebody else. The point of this podcast is uh, to practice and to experience these ideas that we're chatting about. And so, uh, there's only so much benefit from just listening. I hope that you're able to take something away from this conversation that makes you curious, makes you inspired to practice something yourself. And subscribing to the YouTube channel or leaving a review on audio platform just really goes a long way in helping us spread, helping get this in front of more people. And I just want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the podcast. I appreciate you immensely. Love to hear from you. And hopefully you keep enjoying the podcast, because I have many more episodes that I can't wait to share with you. So until next time, my friends.